evening, friends.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for choosing to be with us this evening. We are certainly blessed by your presence here. Well, I hope that over the last couple of weeks, you've had a chance to stop and behold the beautiful lotus flowers that were blossoming out there in our pond. They really are something, aren't they? Well, you know, because of the connection with the lotus and Buddhism, many people often ask me if I planted those lotuses there. Well, the answer is no, unfortunately it wasn't me. They were here before us. But I always believe that they were actually waiting for us. I've tried to maintain this pond over the last couple of years, and in doing so I've been able to be in close proximity with the lotuses, kind of study them, see the process of their growth, and just overall observe them. And over that time, I really feel I've gained an even deeper appreciation for the lotus and what it means. So why is the lotus so special? Well, in Asia, the lotus is widely considered the most sacred of all flowers. The lotus has such deep spiritual and symbolic meaning that it's been revered in ancient religion and philosophy of India even before Buddhism. It's also been portrayed in art, especially in Buddhist art. You'll see almost every image of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva has the Buddha on either standing or sitting on top of a lotus flower or carrying a lotus flower. It becomes almost synonymous with Buddhism. And you'll also see that it's used in agriculture and in medicine. So very important flower and very important plant, the lotus. Now, of course, when you see the lotus, they're beautiful. They're large, they're bold. But what makes them so special isn't just how beautiful they are, but it's their very nature. It's the growth of the development of the lotus that makes them special. Within that process, it's teaching us something very important. In Buddhism, the lotus represents really the transcendence of suffering into awakening. Okay? In short, it represents the Bodhisattva way. So that's what I want to talk about today. By observing the lotus, seeing the way that it grows, we want to emulate that. In other words, live like the lotus. And we know the lotus grows in deep mud, surrounded by murky, swampy, filthy waters. It's not a very great image, is it? Kind of makes you cringe in a way, right? Well, that's actually the same illusion that the people of ancient India had. A feeling of uncleanliness, right? So this mud, this murky water, this represents the suffering world, okay? Or in Buddhist lingo, we call it the Saha world. And you know, the Saha world directly means the world in which suffering must be endured. Although I kind of like Dr. Jean Reeves, Buddhist scholar's interpretation is the world in which suffering can be endured. It gives a more of a positive touch to it, in which it shows that we can overcome it. I'll get into that here in just a second, what that could imply. Because it's not just suffering itself, rather it's the components that lead to suffering that are ever present in this world. And these are the things that are rooted in such of our, what we call the three poisons, including greed, anger, and ignorance. And of course there's a lot of others: envy, jealousy, conflict, a whole lot of other emotions or ways of thinking, but they all arise from those main three poisons. Well, it's not that the lotus is rooted in the mud that makes it significant. Of course, when we look at that, saying the mud itself is that world, the world full of all this potential for suffering, right? But just being in that is not what's going to make it significant, right? It's that it rises above the water that makes it significant. It's not just on the surface like the lilies. You see the lilies, they'll sit on the surface. But this lotus will actually rise above the water, right, and into the air. And when it blossoms completely untainted by the muddy water. This, in essence, represents being free of any illusion. The Japanese poet Saigyo wrote, "The lotus blooming, the waves beating on the shore, my mind hears them as the preaching of the Dharma." This poem means that the sound of the waves and the sounds of the opening of the lotus are teaching them Buddhism. If they can learn some Buddhist teaching from these sounds. Now we know the sound of waves crashing against the shore, right? Well, for me, my interpretation is that teaches me something of transience, this coming and going, constantly coming, constantly going in this way, this motion. Never the same. But what about the sound of the lotus? The sound of the lotus. The lotus makes a sound. But you have to be ready to hear it. It makes a sound, a kind of popping noise on the first opening of its petals. After it's already been opened, it will not make the sound again, but it makes a kind of a pop sound. Pop. And with that pop, that is the real emergence of the flower. It starts to open up and blossom. So this pop, what is it? It's a kind of realization, an epiphany, an aha. So by seeing or hearing that, we recognize that there is all these opportunities for awakening. Well, the flower itself is wonderful, but the whole plant teaches us a lot. As I already likened it to the Bodhisattva practice, well, look at outside here, you see these beautiful leaves, the broad leaves. And some of them are very big. If you look far back out there, very broad and large. One thing that's interesting about the lotus leaves is that they are covered by a special kind of barrier that protects them. And so if you were to drop water on it, or even muddy water or something like that, it won't sit on those lotus flowers, except instead it will roll off of it. It beads up, and it just rolls off. So what does that say about the nature of a bodhisattva? The nature of a bodhisattva is one that is not going to be reactive to things, right? It's going to allow them to just roll off of it. You do something negative to me, right? You say something negative to me. I won't be offended. I won't take it personally. I can be able to allow it to just roll off of me, right? So this is how to deal with the ultimate changing world. All the sufferings that we have, they're there, but we don't allow them to affect us. So that's a wonderful thing. And then now, right now, we have the seeds, the seed pods. Of course, the seed pod is originally at the center of the flower, and the petals only last about 4 days or so before they start falling off. Well, what's left is the seed pod, but you may have noticed that the seed pod tends to grow after the petals fall off. It continues to grow, and then eventually it opens up its little hole there, and it turns its head like this, and it drops the seeds into the water. So this, in a way, shows of how the merit that's gained from the Bodhisattva way goes on to extend further and further to creating more and more merit for others around it. So these are just a couple of ways we can look at the symbolism of the lotus. And in each of this, I think it's pretty plain to see why a sutra would be called the lotus, and why it would be considered by the Buddha to be the most supreme of all sutras and most comprehensive. It's also clear to see why it's the most influential sutra and has been given people encouragement and joy in life since ancient times. The Lotus Sutra goes even further to teach that we can blossom ourselves here within the Saha world, regardless of our conditions. In the Lotus Sutra, there's a story of the treasure stupa. We all know stupas are, right? It's like a mausoleum that comes from underground, right? And inside of that treasure stupa is the abundant treasures Tathagata, abundant treasures Buddha, right? And he emerges because he had made this vow that he wanted to hear, anytime that the Lotus Sutra was being preached, he wanted to be there to bear witness to it, right? So he wants to hear the Lotus Sutra. And also a few chapters later, there's another story of these gazillions of bodhisattvas that also emerge from underground. They come out from under the ground, and they all have this vow. Right? They vow to spread the Buddha's Dharma after his death. In both cases, what's being illustrated is the importance of this world, affirming this world where suffering must be endured. However, on top of that, there is this image of pushing through the ground that I think is quite significant. It takes great effort to get through that ground, right? Just as it does for the lotus to emerge above the water. You may see some of the little lotuses out there, the little baby ones, are still on the surface of the water. It takes a little more energy for them to be more upright and start to rise above the water. So what is that energy? The energy comes from passion. It comes from ambition, the wish to reveal our true natures to the universe. But the mud itself is not just something to be transcended from. The lotus doesn't just uproot itself when it blossoms. It is still firmly grounded in the mud. It needs the mud, you see. It's nourished by that mud. That mud gives it strength. In fact, it's known that the deeper the mud the lotus is planted in, the bigger and more brilliant the lotus flower will bloom. So what are we saying here when we're talking about living like the lotus? Not just the suffering, not just that suffering has to be endured, but that we need it. We need the suffering to truly blossom. In chapter 12 of the Lotus Sutra, Devadatta, it contains the profound verse, "If they are born into the presence of Buddhas, they will be born from lotus flowers." This teaches us that even if we have a mind that's full of delusions, if we have the opportunity to hear the Buddha's teachings, then we can reach a state of purity. We can purify our minds, just like that of the unsullied lotus flower. From this, we can gain a very powerful message from the Buddha, teaching us that even if we are experiencing severe circumstances in which many things are not going our way, things are almost unbearable at times, once we are able to believe in and accept the Dharma, the negative aspects of our lives will be transformed into positive ones instantly. The mud itself can very much be likened to the trends of our times, such as conflict with others, sickness, personal sickness, death of loved ones, overloaded work schedules, traffic. All of these things that we go through in our daily lives can be considered part of that mud, right? The mud that we just have to deal with, right? So, what did it take to live like the lotus in that sense? We have to change our way of looking at it. Change the way of looking at those events and accept them as manifestations of the Buddha's teachings or important lessons for us. Then all of those hardships can become rich nourishment for us. This is what the Buddha teaches us through the symbol of the lotus flower. Precisely because we ourselves experience pain, we can empathize with the hardships of other people. Our failures and our setbacks might be the working of compassion, teaching us humility. Even sickness, as I'm sure many of you know, can be an opportunity to foster the spirit of being grateful for being caused to live. You notice, wow, I may be sick, but look, I'm alive here in this world. Wow, how wonderful. I've been taking these things for granted all this time. In other words, like the lotus that has taken that long path through the mud and through that murky water, seeking the sunlight to open its heart to the world, the experience of suffering allows human beings to also blossom their feelings of true joy and gratitude. So in order to live our lives like the lotus flower and be untainted really means to practice the Bodhisattva way. I'm not going anywhere. I'm rooted in this world. I can't think about what's going to happen in the afterlife, right? I have to make the best of the conditions that I have right now and transform this world into the best that it can be, at least the world around me. And we can do that by first letting go of our self-centered attachments and start thinking about others first. All of us are capable of being welcoming and cheerful towards the people that we encounter. So let's practice that and be just like those lotus blossoms bathed in sunlight that are welcoming us. Thank you very much.